A racist cop arrests a black woman, and the unexpected ending will leave you speechless. What starts as a routine drive turns into a confrontation fueled by prejudice, as Amanda Taylor finds herself unfairly targeted by an officer with an agenda. In a battle of authority and resilience, her fight for justice reveals shocking truths. Have you ever faced or witnessed a moment like this where someone was judged unfairly simply because of who they are? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss an inspiring story like this. Amanda Taylor gripped the steering wheel of her unmarked black SUV, her mind laser-focused on the urgent meeting awaiting her. The vehicle hummed steadily down the quiet suburban streets, its nondescript appearance deliberately chosen to avoid drawing attention. Amanda, a senior NSA agent, knew that blending in was often her best defense. Yet, despite her training and experience, she couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was off. As she approached an intersection, Amanda caught sight of a police cruiser parked idly at the curb. Inside sat two officers, one middle-aged with a hard expression, the other younger and less certain. The older officer's gaze fixed on her SUV with unrelenting scrutiny. Amanda's instincts flared. She glanced at the rearview mirror, adjusting her speed to ensure everything looked normal, even as unease began to churn in her chest. Officer Mark Grant leaned forward in his seat, narrowing his eyes at the SUV. It wasn't just the car, it was the driver, a woman who didn't seem to fit in this suburban neighborhood, at least not in his judgment. Mark had spent decades patrolling high-crime areas, and the years had hardened his perspective. To him, Amanda's presence didn't make sense. "That car's out of place," Mark muttered to his partner, Officer Luke Bradley, who had been scrolling through the onboard computer. Luke glanced up briefly. "Looks like a regular SUV to me," he replied, his tone casual, almost dismissive. Mark shook his head, his eyes still locked on the vehicle. "It's not registered to anyone around here. Something's off." Without waiting for Luke's response, Mark reached for the patrol car's siren controls. The wailing sound of the siren cut through the tranquil morning air, causing Amanda to glance in her rearview mirror. Red and blue lights flashed behind her, and her heart rate quickened. She hadn't been speeding. There was no reason to stop her. "Damn it!" she muttered under her breath, signaling and pulling over to the side of the road. She knew how quickly these encounters could escalate, especially with her line of work. Resting her hands on the steering wheel, she steadied her breathing and prepared herself for the interaction. Mark stepped out of the cruiser with calculated intent, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. Luke followed hesitantly, his uncertainty evident in his slower movements. Approaching Amanda's window, Mark adopted an air of authority that bordered on hostility. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Amanda's eyes met his, calm, yet probing. "No, officer," she said evenly. "Was I speeding?" Mark ignored her question, his gaze scanning the interior of the SUV. "This vehicle isn't registered to you," he said sharply. "Mind explaining why you're driving it?" Amanda kept her expression neutral. "It's a colleague's car," she replied. "I borrowed it for work." Mark's jaw tightened. "Work? What kind of work?" His voice carried a subtle edge of suspicion, as though her answer had only fueled his doubts. Amanda hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "I'm a federal agent," she said, her tone professional but firm. "If necessary, I can provide identification." Mark raised an eyebrow, a sardonic smile forming on his face. "A federal agent?" he repeated, his skepticism dripping with disbelief. "Let me see your ID, now." Luke stood a step behind Mark, watching the interaction unfold. He could see the tension rising, but years of working under Mark had taught him to stay quiet and let his senior partner lead. Still, something about Mark's approach didn't sit right with him. Amanda reached for her glove compartment deliberately, her movements slow to avoid any misinterpretation. She retrieved her NSA credentials and badge, handing them over to Mark. "Here's my identification," she said, her voice steady. "Amanda Taylor, NSA." Mark examined the credentials, flipping the badge over as if searching for flaws. His expression remained hard, his suspicion undiminished. "NSA, huh?" he said, his tone almost mocking. "And what exactly does the NSA have you doing in a neighborhood like this?" "I'm on official business," Amanda said simply, refusing to rise to the bait. Mark took a step closer to the SUV, his eyes narrowing. "Official business doesn't usually involve borrowing unregistered cars, does it?" He gestured toward the passenger seat where Amanda's encrypted tablet lay. "And what's that? Some kind of fancy toy? Stolen government property, maybe?" Amanda's patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to remain composed. "That's an encryption device," she explained. It's standard issue for my job. I suggest you confirm my credentials before making baseless accusations. Mark chuckled coldly, shaking his head. Baseless accusations? People like you think you can flash a badge and get away with anything. Luke shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the interaction spiraling out of control. Mark, he said quietly, maybe we should run her ID through the system. Just to be sure. Mark shot him a glare. I don't need to run anything. I know what I'm looking at. Turning back to Amanda, he snapped, step out of the vehicle. Now. Amanda hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing her options. She could comply and hope to de-escalate the situation, or she could push back and risk exacerbating it. Ultimately, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with her hands visible. Hands where I can see them, Mark barked, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Amanda's jaw clenched, but she complied. Officer, I'm asking you to follow proper procedure, she said evenly. You're overstepping your authority. Mark ignored her, his eyes scanning the interior of the car with renewed intensity. He leaned in and picked up the tablet, holding it up like it was evidence of a crime. Looks like we've got ourselves a hacker, he said smugly. What are you hiding, Agent Taylor? Amanda met his gaze squarely, her voice unwavering. That device is NSA property, and you have no legal right to confiscate it. Mark's smirk deepened. Oh, I think I do. Around here, we don't just take people at their word. The air between them crackled with tension as Mark tightened his grip on the tablet. A tangible power play designed to assert dominance. Luke, standing off to the side, felt his unease grow. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was personal. With Mark's suspicions escalating and Amanda determined to protect her mission, their clash would soon spiral into a conflict neither of them could fully control. Amanda stepped out of the SUV, her posture firm but non-aggressive. She was keenly aware that Mark's behavior wasn't rooted in any real suspicion. This was a display of authority, fueled by bias and ego. Keeping her hands visible, she held his gaze, her composure unwavering. Mark wasted no time asserting control. Open the trunk, he ordered curtly, gesturing toward the back of the vehicle. There's nothing in there you need to see, Amanda replied evenly. I've already identified myself as a federal agent, and this search is unwarranted. Mark's lips curled into a mocking smile. Unwarranted. That's funny. Around here, we decide what's necessary. Now open it, or I'll do it myself. Amanda knew she had little choice. Pushing back any further could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Fine, she said, stepping toward the back of the SUV and unlocking the trunk. She motioned for him to proceed. Go ahead, Officer Grant. But I'll remind you again, this is government property, and your actions are already bordering on misconduct. Mark ignored her warning and began rummaging through the contents of the trunk with exaggerated thoroughness. He pulled out a small duffel bag and unzipped it, sifting through innocuous items. A jacket, a pair of gloves, some personal belongings. His movements were sharp and invasive, as though he expected to find something incriminating. All this equipment, Mark muttered, pulling out a portable radio. You sure you're not running some kind of operation out here? He turned to face Amanda, his eyes narrowing. Maybe something you'd rather not tell us. Amanda didn't flinch. You've seen my credentials. You know exactly who I am. If you have any legitimate concerns, you should contact the NSA for verification instead of making baseless accusations. Mark scoffed. Credentials mean nothing to me. I've seen plenty of fakes in my time. Standing a few steps behind, Luke Bradley shifted uncomfortably. His partner's behavior was becoming harder to ignore. Mark, he interjected softly, maybe we should call it in. If she's telling the truth, Mark spun around, cutting him off. If she's telling the truth, we're here to make sure people don't lie their way out of trouble. Stay out of it, Luke. Amanda observed the exchange, noting the uncertainty in Luke's demeanor. He's right, she said, directing her words to both men. You should call this in. There's no reason for this to go any further. Mark's expression darkened. You don't get to decide how this goes, Agent Taylor. And if you think you're untouchable because of some badge, think again. He turned back to the car, this time focusing on the passenger seat. The encrypted tablet lay there, its sleek black surface catching the light. What's this? Mark asked, grabbing the device and holding it up. Another one of your fancy toys? That's classified equipment, Amanda said firmly. You have no right to confiscate it. Mark smirked, turning the tablet over in his hands. Classified, huh? Sounds convenient. Maybe you're hiding something on here. Stolen data, maybe? Amanda's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let her frustration show. If you don't understand what you're handling, I suggest you put it down. That device isn't something you have the authority to examine. Mark ignored her, his suspicion deepening with every word she spoke. He turned to Luke. Run her name through the system. Let's see if she's got any priors. Luke hesitated. Mark, she's already identified herself as an NSA agent. If we're wrong, Mark interrupted, his voice rising, then she'll have nothing to worry about. But I don't think we are. As Luke reluctantly returned to the cruiser to check Amanda's details, Mark continued his verbal assault. You talk a good game, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's hiding something. And you, Agent Taylor, are hiding plenty. Amanda stepped closer, her voice low but firm. You're stepping way out of line, Officer Grant. I've cooperated with every one of your demands. But this is harassment, plain and simple. Mark took a step forward, closing the space between them. Harassment? That's a big word for someone who's under investigation. Maybe you should think twice before throwing accusations around. The tension between them was electric, the air thick with unspoken threats. Luke returned, holding a printout. Mark, he said cautiously. Her credentials check out. She's exactly who she says she is. Mark barely glanced at the paper. Credentials don't mean anything if the person behind them isn't clean, he said dismissively. He looked back at Amanda. Step away from the vehicle. Amanda's eyes narrowed. I've complied with your every request. If you're going to arrest me, you'd better have a valid reason, because I guarantee you this will not end well for you. Mark stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. We'll see about that, he said finally. You're coming with us to the station. Luke's eyes widened. Mark, we've got no cause to detain her. She's suspicious, Mark snapped. And that's cause enough. Now either help me or stay out of my way. Amanda exhaled slowly, her mind racing through her options. If she resisted, it would only escalate. If she complied, she'd be able to fight this from a stronger position later. Fine, she said coldly. But know this, I'm not the one who'll regret this decision. Mark ignored her warning and motioned for her to turn around. As he cuffed her hands behind her back, he leaned in close. You think you're untouchable? But in my town, no one is. Luke watched in silence, a mix of guilt and helplessness washing over him. He wanted to speak up, to stop this madness, but Mark's authority loomed too large. Instead, he followed as Amanda was led to the patrol car, his stomach churning. The drive to the station was tense and silent, Mark's smug satisfaction palpable. Amanda sat rigid in the back seat, her mind calculating her next move. The hum of the patrol car was the only sound filling the tense air, as Officer Luke Bradley sat stiffly in the passenger seat. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching Amanda Taylor's stoic expression as she sat handcuffed in the back. The weight of her silence pressed heavily on him. Something about this situation felt deeply wrong. Mark Grant, gripping the steering wheel with smug satisfaction, broke the quiet. People like her think they can get away with anything, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Flashing a badge doesn't mean she's above the law. Luke shifted uncomfortably. Mark, he began hesitantly, are we sure about this? Her credentials checked out. She's a federal agent. Mark's jaw tightened. So what? She's hiding something. I can feel it. Luke swallowed hard, choosing his next words carefully. It just seems like maybe we're pushing this too far. Shouldn't we confirm with her agency before taking it any further? Mark shot him a sharp look, his eyes narrowing. Listen, kid, he said coldly. I've been on this job long enough to know when someone's not telling the truth. You don't question me on this. Luke nodded reluctantly, but kept quiet, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. The unease bubbling inside him refused to settle. At the station, Mark marched Amanda through the hallway, his grip firm on her arm. The other officers turned to watch, their curiosity piqued. Luke trailed behind, his hand brushing against his pocket where his phone was tucked away. He hadn't planned on recording anything, but the thought gnawed at him now. If this went south, he'd need proof of what was happening. Mark shoved the door to an interrogation room open and gestured for Amanda to sit. She complied without a word, her gaze steady and unflinching. Luke lingered in the doorway, unsure of where he stood in all of this. Sit down, Bradley, Mark barked, nodding toward a corner of the room. Luke obeyed, reluctantly taking a seat. Mark crossed his arms and stared Amanda down. Let's get one thing straight, he said. You're in my jurisdiction now. I don't care who you work for or what badge you're carrying. If I think you're a threat, you're going to answer for it. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her composure unshaken. And I've told you repeatedly, Officer Grant, I'm on official business. Your actions are a direct violation of federal protocol. Mark's lips twitched in a derisive smile. Official business? Then why the secrecy? Why the borrowed car? And that fancy gadget? What's on it that you don't want anyone to see? Amanda exhaled slowly, her patience clearly wearing thin. I don't answer to you. You've already crossed the line by detaining me without cause. Every second of this is going on record. Mark's face darkened, and he took a step closer to her. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice low. "Because threats don't scare me, Agent Taylor." Luke watched the exchange, his pulse quickening. This wasn't how an investigation was supposed to work. Mark wasn't asking questions to uncover the truth. He was provoking her, pushing her into a corner. "Mark," Luke said carefully, "maybe we should let someone higher up handle this. If she's telling the truth, this could blow back on us." Mark spun toward him, his expression a mixture of irritation and disbelief. "You don't get it, do you?" he snapped. "People like her. They think they're untouchable. It's our job to remind them they're not." Luke's stomach churned. "But what if we're wrong?" he said quietly. Mark took a step closer to him, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "We're not wrong, and if you can't see that, maybe you're in the wrong job." Luke felt the weight of Mark's words like a slap, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and discreetly activated his phone's recording app. If he couldn't stop Mark, the least he could do was document what was happening. Mark turned back to Amanda, pulling out her encrypted tablet and slamming it onto the table. "This," he said, pointing at the device, "is the key to whatever it is you're hiding. And trust me, we'll find out what it is." Amanda's eyes flicked to the tablet, then back to Mark. "That device is NSA property," she said firmly. "You're not authorized to access it." Mark ignored her, leaning forward until their faces were inches apart. "You think I care about authorization? Around here we make the rules." Amanda didn't flinch. "You're digging a hole you won't be able to climb out of, Officer Grant. I suggest you stop while you still can." Mark smirked, straightening up. "We'll see who's in the hole when this is over." Luke's hand tightened around his phone in his pocket. Every word Mark spoke only added to the growing file of evidence against him. He felt a surge of anger, at Mark, at himself for staying silent, and at the entire situation spiraling out of control. But fear kept him rooted in place. Fear of losing his job. Fear of crossing Mark, who had years of clout in the department. Fear of what might happen if he stood up and said, "Enough." As the interrogation dragged on, Mark's questions became increasingly antagonistic, each one designed to trap Amanda rather than seek answers. Luke stayed silent, his phone still recording, though his discomfort was written all over his face. When Mark finally stepped out to run some checks, leaving Amanda and Luke alone, the room was thick with tension. Amanda turned her gaze to Luke, her expression calm but piercing. "You don't agree with this, do you?" she asked quietly. Luke hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "It's not my call," he said weakly. "That's not what I asked," Amanda said. "This isn't right. He's overstepping." Luke's jaw clenched. I can't go against him." Amanda tilted her head slightly. "But you can stay silent and let him get away with this." Before Luke could answer, Mark stormed back in, cutting off their conversation. "No more talking," he barked, glaring at both of them. He pointed at Luke. "Go process her paperwork. I'll handle the rest." Luke stood, his hands trembling slightly. He glanced at Amanda one last time before leaving the room, her words still ringing in his ears. Back in the patrol car later that evening, Luke reviewed the recording on his phone. Every word, every threat, every baseless accusation, it was all there. His heart pounded as he realized the weight of what he held in his hands. This wasn't just evidence against Mark. It was a potential lifeline for Amanda. But it was also a ticking time bomb. If Mark found out, Luke's career, his reputation, even his safety could be at risk. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the save button. After a long moment, he pressed it. Luke's decision to keep the recording set the stage for the next phase of the conflict, as he prepared to involve someone who could challenge Mark's unchecked authority. Ethan Clark stormed into the police station with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning the chaotic scene. He carried a folder of documents under one arm, his expression hard and unyielding. Amanda Taylor's silence over the past few hours had triggered alarm bells at NSA headquarters, and he wasn't about to let the situation spiral further out of control. At the front desk, a young officer tried to block his path. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone a mixture of confusion and hesitation. "I'm here for Agent Amanda Taylor," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Where is she?" The officer hesitated, glancing over at another colleague before replying. "I'm not sure. I didn't ask for speculation," Ethan snapped, slamming the folder onto the desk. "She's a federal agent, and I have authorization to see her immediately. You either bring me to her, or I'll escalate this to your chief." The officer swallowed hard, reaching for the phone. "I'll get someone." In the back office, Mark Grant leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers. He looked up as one of his colleagues entered hurriedly. "There's someone out front. Says he's with the NSA. Wants to see Taylor." Mark's lips curled into a grin. "NSA, huh? Let him in." A moment later, Ethan walked in, his presence filling the room. He wasted no time, tossing the folder onto Mark's desk. "Release her," he demanded. "Now." Mark leaned forward, picking up the folder and flipping through the documents leisurely. "And you are?" "Ethan Clark, NSA," Ethan said coldly. "Amanda Taylor is a federal agent on official business. Detaining her is not only a mistake, it's a violation of federal law." Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You must be mistaken. Around here, I decide what's lawful. And as far as I'm concerned, she's a suspect." "A suspect in what?" Ethan snapped. "You've got nothing on her. No evidence, no cause. You're grasping at straws, and you know it." Mark shrugged, his tone turning mocking. "She's driving an unregistered vehicle with suspicious equipment. That's enough to raise questions. Questions don't justify unlawful detention," Ethan shot back. "You're playing a dangerous game, Officer Grant. I suggest you stop before you get burned." Mark stood, his demeanor shifting from smug to confrontational. "This is my station," he said, his voice rising. "You might think you're some big shot at the NSA, but here, you're just another guy in a suit. I don't take orders from you." Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice but making it even more menacing. "You're overstepping your bounds and you know it. If you don't let her go, I'll make sure internal affairs is all over this place by morning." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "You think threats scare me? I've dealt with worse. And let me remind you, Agent Clark, we're the ones in charge here, not you." Luke Bradley hovered outside the office, his unease growing with each passing second. He could hear the heated exchange between Mark and Ethan through the door, the tension palpable even from the hallway. His phone was still in his pocket, the recording of Mark's earlier behavior a constant weight in his mind. He knew he was sitting on a time bomb, but he wasn't sure when, or how, it would explode. Inside, Ethan slammed his hand on the desk, finally losing his patience. "I'm not here to argue jurisdiction," he growled. "I'm here to ensure my colleague isn't being railroaded by someone with a chip on his shoulder." Mark stepped around the desk, invading Ethan's personal space. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's hiding something." Ethan didn't flinch. "The only thing being hidden here is your lack of authority. You've got no case, no evidence, and no idea what you're dealing with. Let her go." Mark smirked again, refusing to back down. "You can wave your badge and bark orders all you want, but the fact remains, she's staying right where she is until I say otherwise." "You're making a mistake," Ethan warned. "And when this blows up in your face, I'll make sure you're the one who answers for it." The stalemate was broken when Luke finally entered the room, unable to stay silent any longer. "Mark," he said cautiously, "maybe we should re-evaluate. If her agency is involved—" "Stay out of this, Luke," Mark snapped, glaring at his partner. "I've got it under control." Luke hesitated, his gaze flicking between Ethan and Mark. He could see the storm brewing, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could stay in the eye of it. Ethan turned to Luke, his tone softening slightly. "Officer Bradley, this isn't right. This is going to end badly if it continues." Luke's jaw tightened. "It's not my call." "No," Ethan said pointedly. "But it's your conscience." Mark slammed his fist onto the desk, cutting off any further discussion. "Enough, both of you. I'm done with this conversation." Ethan took a step back, his expression hardening. "Fine. Have it your way, Grant. But don't say I didn't warn you." As Ethan left the office, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "I need everything we have on Officer Mark Grant," he said tersely. "Records, complaints, anything. He's about to make this personal." Luke watched Ethan go, his stomach twisting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something big, something he couldn't turn back from. Back in the interrogation room, Amanda sat silently, her expression calm despite the storm brewing around her. She knew Ethan wouldn't let this go, but she also knew Mark wasn't going to back down easily. Ethan's decision to dig deeper into Mark's history would set off a chain reaction, uncovering secrets that would turn the case on its head and escalate the stakes for everyone involved. Luke Bradley paced back and forth in the locker room, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. The recording on his phone was damning. Mark Grant's threats, his baseless accusations, and the veiled admissions of wrongdoing. But acting on it could destroy Luke's career, and possibly more. He clutched his phone tightly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a vice. Bradley! The voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Luke turned to see Officer Craig Miller, one of Mark's closest allies, standing in the doorway. Craig's sharp eyes bore into him, and his tone was anything but casual. "What are you doing in here?" Luke slipped his phone into his pocket, trying to keep his voice steady. "Nothing. Just needed a minute." Craig stepped closer, his demeanor menacing. "You've been acting off all day. You got something on your mind?" Luke shook his head, forcing a neutral expression. "No, everything's fine." Craig didn't buy it. "You know how this works, right? We watch each other's backs. If you're thinking of doing anything stupid like going against Grant, you might want to reconsider." Luke's stomach churned, but he managed to nod. "Got it. Thanks for the reminder." Craig lingered for a moment longer, his gaze heavy with suspicion, before finally walking away. As soon as the door closed, Luke exhaled sharply, his heart racing. He knew he was being watched now, which meant he had to move quickly and carefully. Later that evening, Luke found his chance. The station had quieted down, with most officers either out on patrol or clocking out for the day. Luke waited until the coast was clear, then made his way to the holding area where Amanda was being kept. When he reached her cell, Amanda looked up, her expression sharp and calculating. She said nothing, waiting for him to speak first. Luke glanced over his shoulder, ensuring they were alone before pulling out his phone. "I have something," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Amanda raised an eyebrow, her composure unshaken. "What is it?" Without another word, Luke pressed play on the recording. Mark's voice crackled through the speakers, each word laced with arrogance and malice. "We'll make this stick," Mark had said in the recording. "She thinks she can walk in here and pull rank. I'll find something. Or make something." As the recording played on, Amanda's eyes narrowed. When it ended, Luke stuffed the phone back into his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know what else to do," he admitted. "But you need to know what's going on. It's not just Mark. It's bigger than him. Harris is pulling the strings." Amanda leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Why are you telling me this now?" Luke hesitated, his fear evident. "Because this isn't right. And I can't be part of it anymore." Amanda studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You've done the right thing," she said, her tone steady. "That's more important than the fear." Luke looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "I should have stopped him earlier. I saw it happening, and I stayed quiet." "You're speaking up now," Amanda replied. "That matters." Their conversation was cut short by the sound of footsteps approaching. Luke stiffened, his heart pounding as he turned toward the hallway. Craig Miller's voice rang out, sharp and suspicious. "Bradley? You back here?" Amanda's gaze snapped to Luke. "You need to go," she said quickly. Luke nodded, slipping the phone back into his pocket and turning to leave. He made it down the hall just as Craig rounded the corner. "What are you doing back here?" Craig demanded. "Just finishing up paperwork," Luke said smoothly, keeping his tone neutral. "What about you?" Craig's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. "Make sure you're not wasting time. Grant doesn't like slackers." Luke forced a tight smile. "Got it." As Craig walked away, Luke felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. He knew he'd just put a target on his back. The next morning, Ethan Clark arrived at the station under the pretense of delivering legal documents. In reality, he was there to retrieve the recording. Luke had contacted him through a secure line overnight, explaining the situation. In a private room, Luke handed Ethan the phone, his expression tense. "It's all there," he said. "But if they find out I gave it to you?" "They won't," Ethan assured him. "You're doing the right thing, Officer Bradley, and I'll make sure this gets used properly." Luke nodded, though his unease remained. "You don't know these guys. If Harris finds out—" "He won't," Ethan interrupted. "But if you're in danger, you call me." "Understood?" Luke hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." With the recording in hand, Ethan returned to Amanda's holding cell. He played the audio for her, watching as her expression shifted from anger to icy determination. "This is it," Amanda said when the recording ended. This is the leverage we need. Ethan nodded. But we can't act too quickly. If we tip our hand, they'll bury this before we can use it. Amanda's jaw tightened. And in the meantime, they keep playing their games? Not for long, Ethan replied. We'll use this to go after Harris. He's the key to unraveling all of it. Amanda leaned back against the wall, her mind racing. We need to act fast, she said. If Harris knows we have this, he'll come after Luke. And us. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll protect him, and we'll take them down. Armed with the recording, Amanda and Ethan began formulating their counterattack, setting their sights on Harris and the corrupt network backing Mark. But the stakes were about to rise even higher, and the danger wasn't far behind. The tension in the NSA's Cyber Operations Center was palpable as Amanda and Ethan gathered with their team. Screens lit up with streams of code, alerts flashing across every terminal. The initial warning came from a routine system check. A breach had been detected. What started as a minor anomaly quickly escalated into a coordinated cyber assault aimed at crippling the agency's systems. This isn't random, Amanda said sharply, her eyes scanning the data on the monitor. They're targeting specific files. Ethan leaned over her shoulder. They're after the recording, he said grimly. We need to isolate it now. As the team worked furiously to contain the breach, Amanda noticed something off. One of the analysts, Connor Reed, seemed hesitant, his movements slower than the others. He paused frequently, his screen displaying unfamiliar commands. Reed, Amanda called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. What are you doing? Reed stiffened, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Just running a diagnostic, he replied, his tone too casual. Amanda wasn't convinced. She approached his workstation, glancing at his screen. The data he was accessing had nothing to do with the breach. Step away from the terminal, she ordered. Reed hesitated, then backed off, his expression faltering. I was just sabotaging our efforts, Amanda finished coldly. She turned to Ethan. He's the leak. Ethan's jaw tightened. Get him out of here. Lock him down. Two agents escorted Reed from the room as Amanda returned to her station. The damage had been done. Segments of critical data had been corrupted, and the recording was now at risk of being exposed or destroyed. Hours later, as the breach was contained, another blow landed. News outlets began broadcasting a damning story. NSA agent Amanda Taylor under investigation for espionage. The headlines were as sensational as they were false, complete with fabricated evidence implicating Amanda in a scheme to steal classified information. This is Harris, Ethan muttered, his tone laced with anger. He's pulling the strings. Amanda stared at the screen, her face a mask of cold fury. They're trying to bury us before we can act. Ethan nodded. And they're using the media to shift public perception. If this gains traction, we'll lose credibility. Amanda turned to him, her eyes blazing. We have the recording. Let's release it now. Expose everything. Ethan hesitated. If we go public now, we're putting Lucas in the crosshairs. They'll come after him harder than ever. Amanda's frustration boiled over. They're already coming after us. Every second we wait, they're building their narrative. How long are we supposed to let them control this? Ethan held her gaze, his voice steady. Long enough to make sure we don't lose anyone in the process. Lucas is the key witness. If they take him out, this all falls apart. Amanda clenched her fists, pacing the room. She knew Ethan was right, but the thought of staying silent while the lies spread was almost unbearable. We're running out of time, she said finally. If we wait too long, the damage will be irreversible. We'll act, Ethan assured her, but not recklessly. Meanwhile, Harris, the shadowy mastermind behind the attack, convened a meeting with his inner circle. Sitting in a dimly lit office, he addressed a group of high-ranking officials and operatives. The NSA's containment efforts are holding, but we've weakened their position, Harris said, his voice calm but firm. Now we escalate. Target their witnesses. Target their credibility. Make it impossible for them to recover. One of his subordinates leaned forward. What about Taylor? She's resilient. The media attacks might not be enough. Harris's lips curled into a thin smile. Then we ensure she has no ground to stand on. If necessary, we'll take more direct measures. Back at NSA headquarters, Amanda's team scrambled to restore the corrupted data. A faint hope emerged as the tech lead, Carla Nguyen, announced a breakthrough. "We've isolated a backup," Carla said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's not complete, but it's enough to verify the recording's authenticity." Ethan moved to her side. "Can you secure it?" "I can try," Carla replied. "But if they breach again, we could lose everything." Amanda stepped forward. "Then we need to move now. Get the data secured and encrypted. No more delays." Carla nodded, but the tension in the room was thick. They all knew another attack could come at any moment. As the team worked, Amanda's phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas. "We need to talk. It's urgent." She stepped out of the operations room and called him back. "What's going on?" "They're watching me," Lucas said, his voice shaky. "There's a car parked outside my place. I think it's them." Amanda's grip tightened on the phone. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door for anyone. I'll send someone to get you." "No," Lucas said quickly. "If they see anyone from the NSA, it'll tip them off. I'll figure something out." "Lucas," Amanda said firmly, "you're in danger. We can't afford to lose you." There was a pause before Lucas replied. "I'll be careful. Just do what you need to do. Don't let them win." Amanda ended the call, her mind racing. She returned to the room, her determination sharper than ever. "We're not just fighting Harris anymore," she said to Ethan. "This is a full-blown war." Ethan met her gaze, his expression grim. "Then we need to treat it like one. From this point forward, we go on the offensive." Amanda nodded. "First, we secure Lucas. Then, we take down Harris." The conference room was abuzz with the hum of activity as Amanda Taylor and Ethan Clark finalized their strategy. Activists and whistleblower allies had been carefully selected to attend a press briefing where they would present evidence exposing the shadow organization and counter the false narrative tarnishing Amanda's reputation. Every detail mattered. They had one shot to control the narrative and shift public perception. "Everything hinges on this," Amanda said firmly, scanning the final briefing documents. "Once this goes live, we can't afford to lose control." Ethan nodded. "We won't. We've got the recording, corroborating evidence, and credible voices backing us. Let's make it count." The press conference began under a tense atmosphere. Amanda stood at the podium, Ethan to her right, and a panel of cybersecurity experts and legal advisors seated behind them. Cameras flashed as Amanda began to speak. For weeks, my credibility and integrity have been under attack," Amanda said, her voice calm but resolute. "False accusations of espionage have been circulated to discredit me and the work I do. Today, I'm here to set the record straight." She gestured to a screen behind her, where an excerpt from the recording Luke Bradley had provided played for the audience. Mark Grant's voice filled the room, dripping with malice. "She thinks she can walk in here and pull rank? I'll find something, or make something." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The reporters exchanged glances, some furiously scribbling notes, while others raised their hands to ask questions. "This recording is just the beginning," Amanda continued. "It's proof of a larger, orchestrated effort to undermine justice and conceal corruption within law enforcement and beyond." Before Amanda could proceed further, a commotion erupted near the back of the room. Mark Grant, dressed in his police uniform, strode in, flanked by several officers. His expression was a mixture of defiance and smugness. "Excuse me," Mark interrupted, his voice booming. "I have something to say." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "This isn't the time or place for—" "I think it's exactly the time," Mark shot back, cutting him off. He turned to the crowd, raising his hands dramatically. "The public deserves the truth, not some doctored audio clip." Amanda folded her arms, her expression unyielding. "If you have evidence to support your claims, feel free to share it." Mark smirked. "Gladly." He pulled a folder from under his arm and handed it to a journalist in the front row. "Inside, you'll find documents proving Agent Taylor's so-called encryption device was used in unauthorized data breaches. She's not the hero she's claiming to be." Gasps rippled through the room as the journalist flipped through the folder. Ethan leaned in toward Amanda, whispering, "That's fabricated. We've already verified the original data." Amanda nodded, but kept her focus on Mark. "Interesting," she said, her tone cutting. "You're quick to accuse, but slow to answer. How do you explain the recording we just heard? Or the witnesses who've come forward? Mark's expression faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. Witnesses can be manipulated, and recordings can be edited. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to save face. The tension in the room crackled as reporters fired questions at both Amanda and Mark. Ethan stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady and commanding. The evidence you're holding is falsified. We have independent verification of the original data, and any attempt to mislead the public will only backfire. Before the situation could stabilize, another curveball was thrown. A figure appeared on the screen behind the podium, a man with a shadowy face, his voice digitally distorted. It was clear this was someone from the Shadow Organization. Enough of this circus, the voice said, cutting through the noise in the room. The truth is not what it seems, and Agent Taylor has more to hide than you realize. Amanda stiffened, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. Who are you? She demanded. Why don't you step into the light instead of hiding behind anonymity? The figure chuckled coldly. That's not how this game is played. But I will say this. Your time is running out. The web you're entangled in is much larger than you think. With that, the screen went black, leaving the room in stunned silence. The journalists erupted into a frenzy, shouting over each other for answers. Ethan motioned for Amanda to step back as he took the mic. This is exactly the kind of manipulation we're fighting against, he said, his voice rising above the chaos. A faceless entity trying to intimidate and mislead. But we won't back down. Amanda stepped forward again, reclaiming control. You're right about one thing, she said, her voice unwavering. This isn't just about me. It's about exposing a corrupt system that thinks it can operate without accountability. And I promise you this, we're not stopping until the truth comes out. After the conference, Amanda and Ethan retreated to their temporary operations center to regroup. The media coverage was already polarizing. Some outlets focused on the recording and the mounting evidence against Mark and Harris, while others amplified the shadowy figure's accusations and Mark's fabricated documents. This isn't over, Amanda said, pacing the room. They've thrown everything they have at us and we're still standing, but we need to move faster. Ethan leaned against the table, his expression thoughtful. The Shadow Organization is more entrenched than we thought. They're controlling the narrative from multiple angles. Amanda stopped and turned to him. Then we hit back harder. We double down on the truth, and we don't stop until every piece of their network is exposed. Ethan nodded. Agreed, but we need more. The recording and witnesses won't be enough to dismantle something this big. We need direct evidence linking Harris to the larger operation. Amanda's jaw tightened. Then let's find it. If they think they've won because they threw out some smokescreens, they're wrong. This is just the beginning. The convoy of black SUVs moved cautiously along the desolate highway, surrounded by nothing but dense forest on either side. Lucas sat in the middle vehicle, his nerves raw. 2 NSA agents flanked him, their eyes scanning the shadows beyond the trees. He could feel the tension, each second stretching into an eternity. He gripped the seatbelt across his chest, his mind racing with doubts. They're out there, Lucas murmured, his voice barely audible. One of the agents glanced at him. Stay calm. We've got you covered. But the reassurance felt hollow. He had seen how relentless the Shadow Organization could be. Amanda and Ethan were following a few miles behind in a separate vehicle, monitoring the convoy's movements. Ethan had a radio in hand, his voice steady as he gave orders to the agents ahead. Keep your formation tight. Stay alert for anything unusual, he instructed. Amanda gripped the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road. This stretch of highway is perfect for an ambush, she said. No cover, no witnesses. They'll hit us here. Ethan nodded. That's why we're ready. No sooner had the words left his mouth than a deafening explosion rocked the lead SUV. The blast sent debris flying, and the convoy screeched to a halt. Amanda slammed on the brakes as a hail of gunfire erupted from the tree line. They're here, Ethan said grimly, reaching for his weapon. Chaos unfolded in an instant. Black-clad attackers emerged from the forest, armed with automatic rifles. The lead SUV was engulfed in flames, its occupants likely incapacitated. Lucas's vehicle was now the primary target. Bullets ricocheted off the armored glass as the agents inside scrambled to respond. "We need to move!" one of the agents shouted, yanking Lucas down into the footwell to shield him. "I can't," Lucas stammered, his voice shaking. "We're sitting ducks!" The second agent returned fire through a small opening in the window. "Stay down and don't panic." But Lucas was already panicking. His breathing was rapid, his hands trembling as the sound of gunfire surrounded him. Amanda and Ethan leaped out of their vehicle, using the doors for cover as they assessed the situation. "Take out the shooters on the left flank," Amanda ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. She fired off a series of precise shots, hitting two attackers who had been advancing on Lucas's SUV. Ethan moved to the right, laying down suppressive fire to give the convoy a chance to regroup. "We need to get Lucas out of there," he shouted over the cacophony. Amanda nodded, her mind racing. The attackers were well coordinated, their ambush clearly planned to perfection. But they hadn't accounted for her. Amanda darted toward Lucas's SUV, using the wreckage of the lead vehicle for cover. Bullets whizzed past her, but she kept moving, her focus unshakable. She reached the back door of Lucas's SUV and yanked it open. "Lucas!" she barked, her eyes locking onto him. He looked up at her, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I can't do this," he stammered. "They're going to kill me." Amanda crouched beside him, her voice steady but firm. "Listen to me. This isn't just about you. It's about exposing them, all of them. The truth is bigger than us, Lucas. You can't give up now." Lucas hesitated, his eyes darting between Amanda and the chaos outside. Her unwavering determination seemed to cut through his fear. He said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Amanda replied. She turned to the agents. "We're moving him out. Cover us." With one agent shielding Lucas, Amanda and the other agent provided cover fire as they moved toward Ethan's position. The attackers redoubled their efforts, their shots becoming more erratic but no less deadly. Ethan spotted them and opened the rear door of their SUV. "Get in!" he yelled. Amanda shoved Lucas into the vehicle and climbed in after him, her weapon still trained on the tree line. Ethan jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the accelerator as more bullets pinged off the car's reinforced exterior. The remaining NSA agents covered their escape, holding off the attackers as the vehicle sped away. The ambush had failed, but the attackers weren't done yet. Two black sedans emerged from the forest, engines roaring as they gave chase. Amanda leaned out the window, firing at the pursuing cars. "They're not giving up," she said through gritted teeth. Ethan swerved to avoid gunfire, his focus razor sharp. "Then we'll make them regret it." He veered sharply onto a side road, leading the sedans into a narrow stretch flanked by tall trees. Amanda climbed onto the back seat, aiming for the tires of the lead car. She fired 3 times and the front tire exploded, sending the sedan careening into a ditch. The second car pressed on, its driver determined to catch them. Ethan slammed on the brakes, causing the pursuing vehicle to swerve wildly. Amanda took the opportunity to fire again, this time hitting the engine block. The car sputtered to a stop, smoke billowing from under the hood. Back at a secure safe house, the adrenaline began to wear off. Lucas sat at the table, his head in his hands. Amanda stood across from him, her arms crossed. "You did well," she said, her tone softer now. Lucas looked up, his expression conflicted. "I almost gave up. If you hadn't been there." "But I was," Amanda interrupted. "And you didn't give up. That's what matters." Ethan entered the room, his face grim. "We've got intel from the scene. The attackers weren't just hired muscle. They were part of Harris's network." "He's escalating," Amanda nodded. "Good. Let him escalate. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make." Lucas looked at her, his fear slowly giving way to resolve. "What now?" "Now," Amanda said, her eyes narrowing. "We make them pay for every move they've made." Mark Grant gripped the steering wheel tightly, sweat dripping from his forehead. The roar of his car's engine echoed through the night as he sped down the abandoned highway. His mind raced faster than the vehicle, replaying the series of events that had brought him here. Harris had promised protection, but now it was clear he had been left to fend for himself. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Mark glanced at the screen. It was Harris. He answered quickly, desperation evident in his voice. "You said you'd handle this," Mark snapped. "I'm not going down for your mess." Harris's voice on the other end was cold and detached. You're a liability now, Mark. You've outlived your usefulness. The line went dead. Mark threw the phone onto the floor, cursing under his breath. His chest tightened as the realization hit him. He had been used, and now he was expendable. Amanda and Ethan were in pursuit, their SUV tailing Mark's car at a relentless pace. Ethan kept his eyes locked on the fleeing vehicle while Amanda analyzed their options. "He's desperate," Ethan said. "He knows we're closing in. That makes him dangerous," Amanda replied. "But he won't get far. There's nowhere left for him to run." Mark swerved onto a dirt road leading to an abandoned industrial area. The dark silhouette of a crumbling warehouse loomed in the distance. "He's cornering himself," Amanda observed. "Perfect." Ethan pressed the accelerator, closing the gap between the two vehicles. Mark skidded to a halt in front of the warehouse, jumping out of his car and bolting toward the entrance. He clutched a pistol, his hands trembling as he glanced over his shoulder. The sound of Amanda and Ethan's SUV screeching to a stop sent panic surging through him. "Stay back!" he shouted as they exited their vehicle. "I'm warning you!" Amanda ignored his threat, moving forward with her weapon raised. "It's over, Mark. Drop the gun." Mark backed into the shadows of the warehouse, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I did what I had to. They made me do it." Ethan flanked the entrance, his voice steady. "They left you, Mark. You're on your own now. Drop the weapon, and we can talk." Mark laughed bitterly, his voice echoing off the walls. "Talk? You think they'll let me talk? I'm a dead man either way." Amanda motioned to Ethan, and they advanced cautiously into the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit, cluttered with rusted machinery and stacks of crates. Mark's ragged breathing gave away his position as he moved deeper into the building. "Think about your options," Amanda called out, her tone firm but not aggressive. "You can face justice, or you can keep running until they find you, and they will find you." Mark stepped into the light, his gun still raised but his grip unsteady. "Justice?" he scoffed. "You think justice means anything? They've been controlling everything. Cops, courts, the media. There's no escape." Amanda took a step closer, her weapon trained on him. "You're right about one thing. They control a lot. But not everything. Not anymore." Mark hesitated, his gaze flickering between Amanda and Ethan. His arms began to shake, and the gun slipped slightly in his grasp. "You were just a pawn," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "Harris used you, and now he's done with you. But you can still make it right. Give us what we need, and we'll make sure they pay." Mark's face twisted with anguish. He stared at the ground, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. Slowly, he lowered the gun and let it fall to the floor with a clatter. Amanda moved swiftly, disarming him completely and cuffing his hands. "It's over, Mark." Back at the secure NSA facility, Mark sat in the interrogation room, his head in his hands. The walls seemed to close in around him as Amanda and Ethan entered. He didn't look up. "You wanted to survive," Amanda began, her tone sharp. "Here's your chance. Talk." Mark laughed bitterly, his voice hollow. "You think I have anything left to lose?" "They'll kill me for what I know." "They'll kill you if you don't cooperate," Ethan countered. "But we can protect you, if you give us something useful." Mark finally raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You don't get it. They've got connections everywhere. Politicians, CEOs, cops, it's all part of the same machine. Harris isn't even the top. He's just another cog." Amanda leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Then give us the names, the connections, everything you've got." Mark hesitated, then began to speak. He detailed secret meetings, off-the-books transactions, and the web of corruption that tied the shadow organization together. As he spoke, Amanda and Ethan exchanged glances, the scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. When Mark finished, he slumped back in his chair, exhausted. "That's all I know," he muttered. "It won't be enough. They'll bury you before you can get to them." Amanda stood, her expression resolute. "Let them try. We're not stopping until they're finished." Ethan placed a file on the table. "Your testimony just gave us a roadmap. Harris and his network won't see us coming." Mark looked at them, a flicker of hope in his defeated eyes. "If you bring them down, maybe this will mean something." The room was silent except for the hum of computer servers as Amanda and Ethan stood over Carla Nguyen, the NSA's lead cybersecurity expert. Carla's fingers flew across the keyboard, recovering encrypted data from Amanda's device. A large monitor displayed folders full of financial records, secret communications, and names, dozens of them, linked to the Shadow Organization. "This is it," Carla said, her voice tight with urgency. "They didn't manage to corrupt all the data. We've got enough here to take them down." Amanda leaned in, scanning the files. CEOs, government officials, law enforcement, they've infiltrated every corner of the system. Ethan nodded grimly. "And they're not going to let this go without a fight. We need to move fast." As the team began compiling evidence, an alert flashed across Carla's screen. The NSA's servers were under attack, another breach attempt by the Shadow Organization. This time, it was coordinated and aggressive, aimed squarely at destroying the recovered data. "They're hitting us hard," Carla said, her voice rising as she worked to counter the assault. "They know what we have, and they're throwing everything at us." "Can you hold them off?" Amanda asked, her tone razor-sharp. "I'll try, but they're good. Whoever's behind this knows exactly what they're doing." Ethan stepped away, grabbing a secure phone. "I'll call in reinforcements. We need all hands on deck." The attack escalated rapidly. Firewalls crumbled under the weight of the digital assault, and backup servers began to fail. Amanda stayed by Carla's side, watching as she fought to keep the data intact. The tension was suffocating. "They've breached one of the backups," Carla shouted. "If they get to the main server, we're done." "Redirect them," Amanda ordered. "Feed them dummy files if you have to. Just keep the real data safe." Carla nodded, her focus unbroken. Moments later, a second alert appeared on her screen. "Gotcha," she muttered, a faint smile breaking through the tension. "I've isolated the core files and moved them to an offline drive. They can't touch it now." Amanda exhaled, but only briefly. "Good. Now let's make sure they don't get another chance." Ethan returned with a team of NSA agents and analysts. The room was now a hive of activity as everyone worked to secure the evidence and prepare it for release. Amanda and Ethan began formulating a plan to take the fight to the Shadow Organization. "We can't just sit back and wait for them to strike again," Amanda said. "We need to hit them where it hurts." Ethan nodded. "Agreed. We use what we have to dismantle their operations, expose their financial pipelines, their key players, everything." Amanda scanned the room, her voice steady but commanding. "This ends now, no half measures. We bring the entire system down." The first move was to release critical portions of the data to trusted media outlets. Ethan coordinated with investigative journalists who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Within hours, the first reports went live, revealing the Shadow Organization's vast network of bribery, money laundering, and blackmail. "They'll try to discredit this," Ethan warned. "We need to stay ahead of their counter-narrative." "We will," Amanda replied. "This isn't just about exposing them. It's about cutting off their resources. Without money and influence, they're nothing." As the reports gained traction, the Shadow Organization retaliated. Media outlets sympathetic to their cause began spinning the story, accusing Amanda and Ethan of fabricating evidence. Social media was flooded with disinformation campaigns, sowing doubt and confusion among the public. "They're playing dirty," Ethan said, scrolling through the barrage of false claims. "But that just means we're getting to them." Amanda nodded. "Let them scramble. We'll keep pushing the truth." The real battle unfolded behind the scenes. Using the recovered data, Amanda and Ethan's team tracked down the organization's key operations centers, hidden accounts in offshore banks, encrypted servers in remote locations, and shell companies designed to funnel illicit funds. "We've got a lead," Carla announced. "One of their main servers is in a secure facility downtown. If we can access it, we'll have everything. Communications, financial transactions, even their internal strategies." Amanda didn't hesitate. "We're taking it." Gathered the team. The raid on the facility was swift and precise. Amanda and Ethan led the operation, coordinating NSA agents as they stormed the building. The Shadow Organization had guards in place, but they were no match for the tactical efficiency of Amanda's team. Inside, they found the server room, a fortified space with layers of security. Carla, working remotely, guided them through bypassing the defenses. "We're in," Ethan said as the final lock disengaged. Amanda stepped forward, plugging in a secure drive to extract the data. As the files began to transfer, alarms blared throughout the facility. "They know we're here," Amanda said. "We need to move fast." Minutes later, the transfer was complete. The team evacuated the building as shadow operatives arrived, but it was too late. Amanda and Ethan had what they needed. Back at NSA headquarters, the newly obtained data revealed the full scope of the shadow organization's operations. It confirmed Mark's testimony and exposed even deeper layers of corruption. "This is the smoking gun," Ethan said, scrolling through the files. "There's no way they can deny this." Amanda stood behind him, her arms crossed. "Then let's finish this. Send everything to the DOJ, the press, and every agency that can take them down." The fallout was immediate. Arrests were made across multiple cities as officials and executives connected to the shadow organization were rounded up. Public outrage grew as more revelations came to light. Judges bought off to dismiss cases, politicians enacting policies for bribes, and businesses profiting from exploitation. Amanda and Ethan watched the news reports, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and determination. "This is a start," Amanda said. "But we're not done yet." Ethan glanced at her. "We've gutted their operations, but they'll try to rebuild. People like Harris don't disappear easily." "Then we don't stop," Amanda replied. "We keep the pressure on until there's nothing left of them." The fallout from the shadow organization's exposure sent shockwaves through every corner of society. High-ranking officials, corporate executives, and law enforcement officers were arrested in droves, their connections to the network laid bare. Public outrage grew into a fervent demand for accountability, creating a groundswell for systemic change. At the center of it all stood Amanda Taylor, now a symbol of resilience and justice. In Washington, Amanda stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing a crowd of journalists and supporters. Lucas Bradley stood beside her, his presence a quiet but significant reminder of the journey they had shared. "Corruption thrives in silence," Amanda began, her voice strong and steady. "We've taken the first step by exposing those who abuse their power. But this isn't the end. Reform is necessary to ensure these injustices are never repeated." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Amanda knew the fight was far from over. The shadow organization had fractured, but its remnants still lurked, waiting for an opportunity to rebuild. Behind the scenes, Amanda and Lucas worked tirelessly to draft proposals for reform. They collaborated with lawmakers, activists, and other whistleblowers, focusing on transparency and accountability within law enforcement and the judicial system. In one meeting, Lucas hesitated before speaking. "Amanda," he said, his voice tinged with doubt, "do you think any of this will actually stick? These systems are so entrenched. It feels like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket." Amanda looked up from her notes, her gaze steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But it starts with people like us refusing to give up. You proved that when you came forward, Lucas. You're part of this fight now." Lucas nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. "I just wish it didn't feel so overwhelming sometimes." "It is overwhelming," Amanda admitted, "but every step forward is worth it." Their efforts weren't without resistance. A faction of officials, business leaders, and public figures loyal to the shadow organization began pushing back, using the media to paint Amanda as a rogue agent with a personal vendetta. Protests erupted outside NSA headquarters, with demonstrators accusing her of overreach. During one such protest, Amanda and Lucas stood at a window overlooking the chaos below. "They're scared," Amanda said quietly. "That's why they're fighting so hard." Lucas frowned. "What if they manage to turn the tide? What if people start believing them?" "They might," Amanda admitted. "But we have the truth on our side. And that's something they can't erase." The pressure took its toll. Late one night, Amanda and Lucas found themselves alone in her office, the weight of their work pressing down on them. Lucas sat on the edge of the desk, staring at a stack of files. "You ever think about walking away?" he asked suddenly. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "More times than I'd like to admit. But every time I do, I think about the people who don't have the option to walk away. The ones who've been silenced, exploited, or worse. If we don't do this, Who will? Lucas looked at her. His expression conflicted. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Amanda said. But it's worth it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lucas said, I never thought I'd be part of something like this. I was just a cop trying to get by. Now, it feels like everything I thought I knew is upside down. Amanda gave him a small, tired smile. That's how change feels. Uncomfortable. But it's necessary. As their reforms began gaining traction, Amanda's role expanded. She was invited to speak at universities, international summits, and advocacy groups, sharing her story and calling for systemic accountability. Lucas joined her at many of these events, his testimony as a whistleblower adding weight to their cause. Together, they became a formidable team, a blend of unyielding determination and raw honesty. At one event, a young law student approached them. How do you keep going? She asked. How do you stay hopeful when the system seems so broken? Amanda glanced at Lucas before answering. Because every victory, no matter how small, is a step toward something better. And because giving up isn't an option. But not everyone shared their optimism. A secret meeting between remnants of the Shadow Organization revealed their plans to rebuild. Harris, though now a fugitive, continued to pull strings from the shadows, coordinating efforts to discredit Amanda and restore the network's power. They're gaining too much momentum, one of Harris's allies said. If we don't stop them now, we'll lose everything. Harris's voice was cold and calculating. Then we adapt. Let them think they've won. We'll strike when they least expect it. Amanda and Lucas weren't blind to the lingering threat. In a private conversation, Ethan shared troubling intel. Harris is still active, he said, and he's regrouping faster than we anticipated. Amanda's expression hardened. Then we don't let up. We keep the pressure on until there's nothing left of them. Lucas looked uneasy. And what if they come after us again? What if this time they succeed? Amanda placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we fight harder. They've underestimated us before. They won't get that chance again. The quiet hum of Amanda Taylor's car broke the stillness of the suburban night. She scanned her surroundings, her instincts on high alert after weeks of constant threats. The Shadow Organization was wounded but far from defeated, and she knew they wouldn't stop coming for her. She turned onto her street, the headlights illuminating the rows of neatly kept houses. As she approached her driveway, a flicker of movement caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Her heart rate spiked, but her training took over. She parked the car, killing the engine while keeping her hand on the door handle. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged, their silhouette faintly visible in the glow of a nearby street lamp. Amanda acted instantly, diving out of the car and rolling to the ground as a loud crack shattered the silence. A bullet pierced the driver's side window where she had been moments before. From her crouched position behind the car, Amanda drew her sidearm, her eyes scanning the darkness. A second shot rang out, missing her by inches. She located the shooter, a figure hiding behind a cluster of bushes at the edge of the yard. Amanda steadied her breathing, aimed, and fired 2 quick shots. A pained cry confirmed she'd hit her mark. The attacker stumbled out of the shadows, clutching their shoulder, and bolted toward a waiting vehicle. Tires screeched as the car sped off into the night. Amanda didn't pursue. She knew better than to chase blindly. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed Ethan. They tried, she said, her voice calm but tense. But they failed. The next morning, Ethan and Lucas joined her at a secure NSA location. The air was thick with tension as they reviewed security footage from Amanda's neighborhood. The vehicle used in the attack had been stolen, and the attacker left behind no identifying details. This wasn't just a random hit, Ethan said, pacing the room. This was planned. They knew where you'd be and when. Amanda leaned against the table, her expression hard. They're getting desperate. We've exposed too much for them to let us walk away. Lucas shook his head, his voice filled with frustration. Desperate or not, they almost got you. How much longer can we keep dodging their bullets? As long as it takes, Amanda replied firmly. We've come too far to stop now. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office thousands of miles away, a man sat behind a massive desk. His face was obscured by shadows, but his voice carried the weight of authority. Harris's replacement, or perhaps the real leader of the Shadow Organization, was making his move. The attempt failed, an operative reported, standing stiffly before the desk. The man's fingers drummed against the wood. "I expected more," he said coldly. "If you can't eliminate her, you'll ensure she's too busy surviving to be a threat. Increase the pressure. Make her life unlivable." "Yes, sir," the operative replied before leaving. The man turned to the large screen behind him, which displayed Amanda's photo along with detailed surveillance files. His lips curled into a faint smile. "You think you've won, Agent Taylor," he murmured. "But this is only the beginning." Amanda's resolve only grew stronger after the attack. At a public press conference 2 days later, she stood before a crowd of reporters and citizens, flanked by Lucas and Ethan. Despite the lingering threat, she refused to let fear dictate her actions. "I'm still here," she began, her voice steady and firm. "And I'm not going anywhere." Cameras clicked, capturing every word as Amanda continued. "What we've uncovered isn't just corruption. It's a systemic effort to erode justice, to shield the powerful, and to silence the truth. But let me be clear, they will not succeed. The truth will always find a way." Applause erupted from the crowd, but Amanda's mind was already on the next battle. Later that evening, Amanda and Lucas sat in a quiet office, reviewing the latest intelligence. Lucas looked over at her, his expression serious. "Do you think it'll ever stop?" Amanda didn't look up from the file in her hands. "No," she said simply. "Not as long as people like Harris exist." Lucas exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Then why keep going? Why not step back and let someone else take the lead?" Amanda finally met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Because it's not about me. It's about the truth. If we stop, they win. And I'm not willing to let that happen." Lucas nodded, her words settling over him like a challenge. "Then I'm with you. Whatever comes next, I'm in." The shadow organization wasn't finished, and neither was Amanda. As she prepared for the battles ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the war had only just begun. But she was ready. Standing at the window of her office, Amanda gazed out at the city below, the weight of her mission pressing on her shoulders. She knew the risks, the sacrifices, and the price of her fight. But she also knew she couldn't stop. "They'll come again," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "They always do," Amanda replied. "And when they do?" Amanda turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready." Far away, the man in the shadowy office made his next move. Surveillance feeds, classified documents, and coded messages flickered across his screen. His smirk widened as he pressed a button on his desk. "Begin Phase 2, he said. "Yes, sir," came the reply. The camera zoomed in on Amanda's face on the screen, her determined eyes locked in a silent stare. As the screen faded to black, Amanda's voice rang out in memory. "I will continue. They cannot stop the truth." As Amanda Taylor's journey shows, the fight for justice is never easy, and the battle against corruption is far from over. Her unwavering resolve to stand up to those who abuse their power reminds us all that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. But what about you? If faced with impossible odds, would you take a stand or step back in fear? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to share and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that shine a light on the truth and those who dare to uncover it. Together, we can make a difference.
The sun dipped below the skyline of downtown Atlanta, painting the city in hues of orange and pink. Officer Jack Thompson drove through the business district, his patrol car reflecting the fading light. It had been a long day, and his patience was wearing thin. At 35, Jack had spent over a decade on the force, and his job had come to define him. He prided himself on keeping the streets clean, even if his methods were sometimes questionable. To him, keeping order meant maintaining certain boundaries and deciding who belonged where. His colleagues called him dedicated, his superiors problematic. But Jack believed he was just doing what was necessary. The captain's voice still echoed in his ears from that morning's briefing. "Another incident like that, Thompson, and you're out," he'd said, his tone heavy with disappointment. Jack's blood had boiled with shame as he'd stood there, eyes fixed on the floor while his peers looked on. But what did they know? They weren't the ones who had to face the daily chaos on the streets. As he cruised past Monroe Tower, a glistening monolith of glass and steel, something caught his eye. A well-dressed black man stood by the entrance, seemingly out of place among the rushing office workers heading home. Jack's instincts kicked in. He slowed the car and watched. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, checking his watch every few seconds. Suspicious, Jack thought. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was this guy casing the place? Or maybe he was waiting for someone to let him in so he could pull some kind of con. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He'd seen it before, people acting like they belonged somewhere they didn't. This guy looked like trouble, and Jack wasn't going to let him get away with whatever he was planning. Jack pulled the car over and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached the man. He made sure his posture was intimidating, his hand hovering near his holster. "Hey!" Jack called out sharply, his voice carrying through the evening air. "What are you doing here?" The man turned slowly, his eyes meeting Jack's. He looked surprised but composed. "Good evening, officer," he said in a calm, measured tone. "I'm waiting for a meeting. I work here." Jack's eyes narrowed. He glanced up at the building and then back at the man. "You work here?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You got any ID to prove that?" The man nodded, reaching into his pocket. "Of course," he said, pulling out a badge and extending it towards Jack. "David Williams, Executive Director." Jack snatched the badge from his hand and looked at it briefly. It looked legitimate, but something about this guy's calm demeanor rubbed him the wrong way. He shoved the badge back into David's hand. "Executive Director of what?" he demanded, his tone accusatory. David held his gaze unflinching. "Of this building, officer. I'm the new CEO of Williams & Associates. We just moved our headquarters here." Jack let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You right? And I'm the President of the United States," he sneered. "You expect me to believe that you're the CEO of this place?" David's expression tightened, but he kept his composure. "Officer, if you contact the building security, they'll confirm who I am." Jack shook his head, ignoring the suggestion. He felt his anger rising. This guy was too calm, too collected, like he thought he was better than everyone else. Jack's mind flashed back to his childhood, to the rich neighborhoods his mother used to clean. He remembered the disdainful looks, the way people like this guy had treated his family as if they were invisible. And now, here was this man standing in front of him, acting like he owned the place. "I don't need to check anything," Jack snapped. "I know your type. You think you could just walk in here, dressed up like that, and nobody's going to ask questions?" David took a deep breath, his jaw clenching for a moment before he spoke. "Officer, I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just here for a meeting. If you'd like, I can call the person I'm meeting with." "Enough!" Jack cut him off, stepping closer, his voice rising. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You think you can just pull out a fancy card and make me go away?" David held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Please, there's no need for this. I've done nothing wrong." Jack's eyes blazed. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, the familiar rush of control. "You're trespassing, and you're resisting a lawful order," he shouted, his face inches from David's. David's eyes widened slightly, the first sign of real fear. "I'm not resisting anything, officer. I'm just asking you to check." "I said enough." Jack's voice boomed. The crowd around them was growing, people pulling out their phones, whispering among themselves. But Jack didn't care. His focus was solely on David, on putting this man in his place. David looked around, seeing the phones pointed at them, the concerned faces watching. His face flushed with humiliation. He looked back at Jack, and his voice was low, almost pleading. "You're making a mistake." The words ignited something in Jack, a spark of rage that he couldn't contain. "A mistake," he snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you're going to tell me how to do my job?" Without warning, Jack shoved David hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The briefcase fell from David's hand, its contents spilling onto the sidewalk, documents scattering like leaves. David struggled to regain his balance, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Pick it up," Jack barked, his face red with anger. "Pick up your stuff and get the hell out of here." David hesitated, glancing down at the scattered papers. His hands shook slightly as he knelt, gathering the documents. The crowd murmured, a few people stepping forward, but nobody intervened. They just watched, their phones capturing every humiliating second. As David picked up the last of the papers, he looked up at Jack, his eyes filled not with anger, but with something else, something almost like pity. "You really don't know what you're doing," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the street. Jack's lips curled into a sneer. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. Before David could respond, the building manager burst through the doors, his face pale and eyes wide. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, rushing over. "Officer, stop this right now!" Jack turned, taken aback by the man's panicked tone. "Stay out of this," he warned, but the manager ignored him, kneeling beside David. "Mr. Williams, are you all right?" the manager asked, his voice laced with worry. He turned to Jack, fury in his eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at David, who was now standing, dusting off his suit. "This man," the manager said, pointing to David, "is the new CEO of the company that owns this building." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jack's mind went blank. He stared at David, his heart hammering in his chest. This couldn't be real. The man he'd just humiliated, the man he'd treated like a criminal, was the new CEO. David straightened, holding up his ID for the crowd to see. "I tried to tell him," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor of pain that crossed his face. But he wouldn't listen. Jack's mouth went dry. He glanced around, seeing the judgment in the faces of the onlookers, the condemnation in their eyes. The phones, still pointed at him, captured every agonizing second of his disgrace. He wanted to disappear, to vanish from this nightmare. David looked at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that gaze, Jack saw no anger, no rage, only disappointment and something deeper, something that made his stomach twist with shame. "Officer," David said softly, "I don't want any trouble. I just want to go to my meeting." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stood there, paralyzed, as David turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him like a sea. The manager shot Jack a look of pure disdain before following David into the building. Jack felt the world close in around him, the weight of his actions crashing down like a tidal wave. He had lost control. He had humiliated an innocent man, no more than that, someone who could end his career with a single phone call. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Jack stood alone on the sidewalk, the reality of what he'd done sinking in. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, a voice whispered a chilling truth. He deserved every bit of what was coming. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall of his small apartment. His uniform, still stained with the grime of the day, lay crumpled in a heap on the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The events of the afternoon played over and over in his head like a nightmare on repeat. No matter how much he wanted to wake up, he couldn't escape the reality of what he'd done. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. He hesitated before picking it up, his heart pounding. The screen was filled with notifications, missed calls, messages, emails, all from people he knew, colleagues, friends, even his family. But he couldn't bring himself to open any of them. He knew what they would say. They would all be the same. Disbelief, anger, disappointment. He threw the phone back down, his hands trembling. What had he been thinking? He'd let his temper get the better of him, and now he was going to pay for it. He could already see the headlines. Veteran officer assaults innocent man in broad daylight. His stomach churned at the thought. Jack stood up abruptly, pacing the room. He needed to get out, to clear his head. He grabbed his jacket and keys, leaving the mess of his apartment behind as he stepped out into the chilly night air. The streets were quiet, the city a far cry from the chaos of earlier. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts a jumbled mess of regret and anger, mostly at himself. He turned the corner and found himself in front of a familiar bar, a place he used to frequent with his colleagues after long shifts. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The dimly lit interior was almost empty, save for a few regulars hunched over their drinks. Jack slid onto a stool at the bar, nodding at the bartender. "Rough day," the bartender asked, setting down a glass of whiskey in front of him without Jack even having to ask. Jack let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea," he muttered, taking a long sip. The warmth of the alcohol did little to dull the gnawing guilt in his gut. The bartender gave him a sympathetic look. "You want to talk about it?" Jack shook his head. "Not much to say. Just screwed up big time." He stared into his glass, the whiskey reflecting his troubled expression. He could still see David's face, the calm, dignified way he'd handled the entire humiliating encounter. And then the look on his face when Jack had hit him. That was what haunted Jack the most. There hadn't been anger or fear, just a kind of sad resignation, like he'd expected it. He downed the rest of his drink in one gulp, signaling for another. As the bartender poured, Jack's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, seeing a message from his mother. His heart sank. He knew she must have seen the video by now. The thought of her watching it, seeing her son behave like that, made his chest tighten with shame. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, unable to bear reading her words. "What happened, man?" The bartender's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Jack looked up, surprised by the question. He didn't usually talk about work, especially not to strangers. But tonight, the weight of what he'd done was crushing him. He needed to unload, to say something before it drove him insane. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The bartender raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. "We all make mistakes," he said, his tone gentle. Jack shook his head, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was different. I'll let my temper get the best of me, and now I don't know what's going to happen." The bartender nodded, leaning on the counter. "Sounds like you've got some serious thinking to do." Jack let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's putting it lightly." He took another sip, the burn of the whiskey doing little to calm his nerves. As the night wore on, the bar began to fill up, but Jack barely noticed. He was lost in his thoughts, replaying the incident over and over, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He'd let his prejudice cloud his judgment. The realization made him feel sick. He'd always prided himself on being fair, on doing what was right. But today, he'd been no better than the thugs he'd spent his career trying to put away. He thought about David again, the way he kept his dignity even in the face of Jack's hostility. Jack felt a pang of something he wasn't used to, shame. How could he have been so blind, so full of hate that he couldn't see the person standing right in front of him? The door of the bar swung open, and a group of off-duty officers walked in, laughing and talking loudly. Jack turned away, hoping they wouldn't notice him. But it was too late. "Thompson," one of them called out, a broad smile on his face. "What are you doing here, man? Thought you'd be out celebrating." Jack forced a smile, his insides churning. "Yeah, something like that," he mumbled. The group pulled up stools next to him, oblivious to his discomfort. They ordered drinks, chatting about the day's events. Jack tried to tune them out, but their voices cut through his thoughts like a knife. "You hear about that video going around?" One of them said, his tone laced with amusement. "Some cop laid out a guy right in front of Monroe Tower. Can you believe it?" Jack's blood turned to ice. He felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their smiles fading as they took in his expression. "No way," another officer said, his eyes wide with realization. "That was you, wasn't it?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The group fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them like a dark cloud. The officer who had spoken first let out a low whistle. "Damn, Thompson, you really screwed up." Jack stood abruptly, knocking his stool over in his haste. He threw a few bills on the bar and walked out, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. He leaned against the wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He felt like he was drowning, the pressure of his actions crushing him. He knew he couldn't run from this, couldn't hide from the mess he'd made, but he didn't know how to face it either. As he stood there, his phone buzzed again. With shaking hands, he pulled it out and read the message from his mother. "Call me. We need to talk." Jack stared at the screen, his throat tightening. He knew she would try to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But he also knew it wouldn't be true. Nothing would ever be the same again. The sun had barely risen when Jack pulled into the parking lot of the precinct. He sat in his car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, the tension in his shoulders a heavy, oppressive weight. Today was the day he would have to face the consequences of his actions. His suspension was just the beginning. Now, with David Williams leading the investigation, Jack knew that his entire career hung in the balance. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way inside. The air was thick with tension as he walked through the station. Officers who had once greeted him with nods or pats on the back now averted their eyes. Whispers followed him as he made his way down the hall, his gaze fixed on the floor. The shame he felt was palpable, a constant ache in his chest. He reached the conference room and hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He knew what awaited him inside, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. He closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath before pushing the door open. The room was packed. Several officers, including the captain, sat around the table, their expressions grim. At the head of the table sat David Williams, looking calm and composed, despite the bruise still visible on his cheek. His presence dominated the room, a stark reminder of what Jack had done. Jack's heart pounded as he stepped inside, the door closing with a heavy thud behind him. He felt like he was walking into his own execution. David glanced up, his gaze meeting Jack's for a split second before he turned back to the papers in front of him. A young woman stood beside him, flipping through a thick stack of documents. She looked up, her eyes cold as she watched Jack take his seat. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice firm and businesslike. "I'm Sarah Collins, Mr. Williams' legal counsel. We're here today to discuss the events of last week and the subsequent investigation into your conduct." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. His mouth was dry, and he struggled to find his voice. "Yes, ma'am." The captain, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at Jack. "Thompson, do you understand the severity of the situation you've put yourself in?" Jack nodded again, his heart hammering in his chest. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Collins continued, her gaze fixed on Jack. "We've reviewed the footage of the incident, as well as the statements from witnesses. It's clear that your actions were not only unprofessional, but also indicative of a deeper issue within the department." Jack flinched at her words, shame washing over him like a wave. He glanced at David, but the other man's expression was unreadable. Jack wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he knew there was no defense for what he'd done. He'd let his anger, his prejudice, take over, and now he was paying the price. "We'll be conducting a thorough review of your past conduct," Sarah continued. "Any similar incidents will be considered as part of this investigation." Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew his record wasn't spotless. There had been other complaints, other instances where he'd crossed the line. He'd always managed to get off with a warning or a slap on the wrist, but now it was different. The room was silent as Sarah handed a folder to David, who flipped through it slowly, his eyes scanning the pages. Jack watched him, his stomach twisting in knots. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, David looked up, his gaze locking onto Jack's. "Officer Thompson," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Jack nodded, his palms sweating. "Of course." David's eyes were piercing, and Jack had to force himself not to look away. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Jack felt his heart skip a beat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Why had he done it? The answer was so simple, yet so impossible to say. He'd let his fear, his anger, his own prejudices get the better of him. But how could he admit that, sitting here in front of the man he'd humiliated? Jack's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, trying again. "I made a mistake. I let my emotions take over." David didn't look convinced. "Your emotions?" he echoed, his tone disbelieving. "What kind of emotions make a man act like that?" Jack felt his face flush with shame. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting for his response. "I was angry," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. I thought you didn't belong there." There. He'd said it. The truth. Ugly and raw. He'd looked at David and judged him, decided he didn't belong, all because of the color of his skin. It was a hard thing to admit, even to himself, Jack felt his throat tighten, his vision blurring as he stared down at the table. David was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "You thought I didn't belong because I'm black." It wasn't a question, but Jack nodded anyway, unable to meet his eyes. The room was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know what it's like, Officer Thompson?" he asked softly. "To be judged like that every day of your life?" Jack shook his head, his chest tightening with guilt. He had no idea. He'd never even thought about it. He'd spent his life believing he was the one under attack, that he had to defend himself and his way of life. But he'd never stopped to consider how his actions, his words, affected others. David let out a soft sigh. "I don't want to see you lose your job, Jack," he said quietly, surprising everyone in the room. "But something has to change." Jack looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "What do you mean?" David's gaze was steady. "I'm willing to drop the charges," he said, glancing at his lawyer, who looked shocked. "But on one condition." Jack's heart leapt with hope. "Anything." David leaned forward, his eyes boring into Jack's. "You have to take responsibility for what you've done. Not just to me, but to everyone you've wronged. You need to understand why you acted the way you did, and you need to change." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "How?" he whispered, his voice shaky. David's expression softened slightly. "There's a program," he said. "It's designed to help people confront their biases, to learn and grow. I want you to attend it, and I want you to share your story publicly." Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine. The thought of standing in front of people, admitting what he'd done, terrified him. But he knew he had no choice. If he didn't, he'd lose everything. His career, his reputation, his future. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'll do whatever it takes." David nodded slowly. "Good," he said, his gaze never leaving Jack's. "Because this isn't just about you, Officer Thompson. It's about changing a system that's been broken for a long time. And that starts with you." The room was silent as Jack absorbed his words. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his actions, the impact they had on others. And he realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that this was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. But maybe, just maybe, it was a journey worth taking. Jack stood outside the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. It was an old, nondescript building in a quieter part of the city, far removed from the hustle and bustle of downtown Atlanta. A banner above the door read, "Unity through Understanding," and beneath it, smaller letters spelled out, "Bias Awareness and Reconciliation Program." Jack swallowed hard. He hadn't been sure he would come, even after agreeing to David's condition. But now that he was here, he felt the familiar wave of anxiety and resistance rise in his chest. He glanced at the people walking past him, wondering what they would think if they knew who he was and why he was here. After all, the video of his confrontation with David had spread like wildfire. People knew his face, and worse, they knew his actions. He felt exposed, as if he was walking around with a giant neon sign above his head that read, "This man made a terrible mistake." Taking a deep breath, Jack pushed open the door and stepped inside. The small lobby was filled with pamphlets and posters promoting various support groups and community programs. He could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from down the hall. A receptionist looked up from her desk, giving him a polite smile. "Welcome. Are you here for the bias awareness session?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I'm Jack Thompson." The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and he saw the recognition flicker in her eyes. But she quickly recovered, nodding as she handed him a name tag. "We're glad to have you here, Officer Thompson. The session is just down the hall, first door on the left." "Thanks," Jack muttered, taking the name tag and sticking it to his shirt. He made his way down the hall, his stomach churning with nerves. What was he even doing here? How could sitting in a circle and talking about his feelings possibly fix the mess he'd made? He paused outside the door, the low hum of conversation drifting through the air. With a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was set up in a circle, with about a dozen chairs filled by people of various ages and backgrounds. Some looked up as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. Jack recognized a few faces from the videos and articles that had surfaced online, activists, community leaders, and even a few people he'd arrested during his career. A wave of shame washed over him, and he had to fight the urge to turn and leave. "Come on in," a voice called from across the room. A middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind smile gestured to an empty chair. "We're just getting started. I'm Paul, the facilitator. You must be Officer Thompson." Jack nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He felt all eyes on him as he crossed the room and sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clenched in his lap. "Welcome, Jack," Paul said warmly. "We appreciate you being here. It takes courage to face your mistakes and try to make things right." Jack's jaw tightened. Courage. That word felt hollow in his ears. Was it really courage when he didn't have a choice? When this was the only way to salvage what was left of his life? Paul continued, introducing the other members of the group, many of whom shared brief stories of their own experiences with bias, discrimination, and the impact it had on their lives. Jack listened, his gut twisting with each account. There was a young woman who'd been harassed at work because of her accent, an elderly man who'd been treated like a suspect for decades because of the color of his skin, and a teacher who'd been targeted for being openly gay in a conservative community. As each person spoke, Jack felt the weight of their words settling on his shoulders, heavier and heavier. His own actions seemed even more shameful in the face of their courage and resilience. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, his mouth dry. I don't really know what to say," he began, his voice shaky. He glanced around the circle, seeing the guarded expressions on the faces of the people around him. "I've made some mistakes, big ones, and I'm trying to figure out why." He paused, the silence in the room pressing down on him. He could feel their skepticism, their doubt. Why should they believe him? He'd spent years enforcing the law, believing he was on the right side of justice. And now, here he was trying to explain himself to the very people he'd wronged. "I've been a cop for a long time," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I thought I was doing my job, protecting people. But I see now that I've hurt people too. I judged them without even realizing it. I thought I knew what was right, what was best. But I didn't. I was wrong." His words hung in the air, the room silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Jack felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never felt before. He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the people he'd dismissed as criminals, as troublemakers, without ever truly seeing them. A young man with a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Why now?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Why do you care now? After all the damage you've done?" Jack flinched, the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. Because I saw what I'd become. I saw myself in that video, and I didn't recognize the person I was looking at. I don't want to be that man anymore." The room was silent, the tension thick. Jack felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. He didn't know what else to say, how to make them believe that he was sincere. He knew words wouldn't be enough. Paul nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "It's a start, Jack. Acknowledging that you were wrong is the first step, but it's not the only step." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He was so tired of fighting, tired of being angry, tired of the man he'd become. He just wanted to find a way to make things right. The session continued, with each person sharing their stories and feelings. Jack listened, his heart aching with every word. He realized slowly, painfully, that this was what he'd been missing all along, listening. He'd spent his life speaking, judging, acting, but he'd never truly listened. As the session drew to a close, Paul stood up, smiling warmly at the group. "Thank you all for sharing. Remember, change is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but with time and effort, we can all learn to see each other differently." The group began to disperse, people milling around, talking quietly among themselves. Jack stood feeling drained. He was about to leave when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the young man with the tattoo looking at him, his expression still guarded but less hostile. "You've got a long way to go, man," he said quietly. "But at least you're here." Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thanks," he murmured, not trusting himself to say more. As he left the building, the cool evening air hit his face, a reminder of how much his world had changed in such a short time. He still had a lot to figure out, a lot to learn, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be better. The auditorium was packed. Rows of people, from students to community leaders, filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Jack stood at the back, hidden in the shadows, watching the crowd grow. His heart raced, his palms slick with sweat as he glanced at the podium set up at the front of the stage. Beside it was a banner that read, "Community Forum on Racial Reconciliation and Justice." This was it, the culmination of the past few weeks. Therapy sessions, workshops, and hours spent confronting his own prejudices and mistakes. Jack had attended every session of the program, listening to stories from people who had been marginalized and mistreated. He had shared his own story, faced the anger and pain of those he had wronged, and for the first time in his life, he had begun to understand. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was expected to stand before this crowd and talk about what he had learned. As the last of the audience settled into their seats, a hush fell over the room. David Williams stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding attention. Jack felt a pang of anxiety, remembering their first meeting, the anger and shame he had felt. But David had shown him more grace than he deserved. He had guided Jack through the process, even though he had every reason to turn his back. David adjusted the microphone, his calm gaze sweeping over the audience. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is about more than just talking. It's about listening, understanding, and finding a path forward." There was a murmur of agreement, the crowd leaning in as David spoke. Jack felt his heart clench. David had become a respected voice in the community, a symbol of strength and resilience. And now, here he was ready to give Jack the chance to make things right, or at least to begin to. David glanced toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Jack's. He gave a small nod, and Jack felt his stomach drop. It was time. He took a deep breath, his legs shaky as he made his way down the aisle. Every step felt heavy, like he was walking through quicksand. As he reached the stage, David extended a hand, pulling Jack up beside him. "Many of you know who this man is," David said, his voice steady. "You've seen the video. You know what happened. But what you don't know is the journey we've been on since that day." Jack's throat tightened as he took the microphone from David, his hands trembling. He looked out at the sea of faces, all watching him intently. For a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. But then he saw his mother, sitting in the front row, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and pride. She had been his rock through all of this, encouraging him to keep going, to be better. And she was here, supporting him, even after everything. He took another deep breath, forcing himself to speak. "I don't really know where to start," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've spent my whole life believing I was a good guy, that I was doing the right thing, protecting people. But I wasn't. I was protecting myself, my beliefs, my prejudices." He paused, glancing at David, who gave him a reassuring nod. "What I did to David was wrong. It was more than just a mistake. It was a reflection of a system that's been broken for a long time. And I was a part of that system." Jack's gaze swept over the crowd, seeing the skepticism, the doubt in their eyes. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince them that he had changed, but he had to try. "I hurt people," he continued, his voice stronger now. "Not just David, but others. People who didn't deserve it. People I judged because of their skin color, their clothes, where they were standing. I thought I was justified, but I wasn't." He glanced down at his hands, at the calluses and scars. They had been his tools, his weapons. But now, they felt like a reminder of everything he had done wrong. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to understand why I did what I did. And the truth is, there's no excuse. I was afraid of what I didn't understand. And that fear turned into anger, into hate." The room was silent, every eye on him. Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't bother wiping it away. "I can't change what I did," he said softly, "but I can change who I am. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for the chance to be better." There was a long pause, the air thick with tension. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he waited, unsure of what would happen next. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. It was a hesitant sound at first, but then others joined in, and soon the room was filled with applause. Jack looked around, stunned, as people nodded and murmured their approval. David stepped forward, taking the microphone back. "Thank you, Jack," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It takes courage to stand up and admit when you're wrong, and it takes even more courage to change." He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over them. "We have a long way to go. This isn't the end of the journey. It's just the beginning. But if we can listen to each other, if we can learn from each other, then we can start to make real change." The applause grew louder, people standing, some wiping away tears. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him, a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was a start. After the event, people mingled in the lobby, talking quietly among themselves. Jack stood off to the side, unsure of what to do. He had never been good at these kinds of things, and now, with so much hanging over him, he felt even more out of place. A man approached him, his expression serious. Jack tensed, bracing himself for whatever was coming. But the man held out his hand. "My name's Marcus," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for speaking up." Jack stared at the outstretched hand, then took it, shaking it firmly. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus nodded, his grip strong. "What you did, it means something. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." Jack nodded, unable to find the words. He watched as Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see David standing beside him, a small smile on his face. "You did good, Jack," he said quietly. "You've got a long road ahead, but I believe in you." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." David nodded, his eyes kind. "It's not about you and me anymore, Jack. It's about all of us, about making this world a better place." Jack looked around the room, at the people talking and laughing, at the connections being made. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could do it. Maybe they could change. As he left the auditorium that night, the cool breeze on his face, Jack felt a sense of peace. He had a lot to make up for, a lot to learn, but he was ready. Ready to listen, to understand, to be better. And for the first time in his life, he knew that he wasn't alone. They were all in this together, and together they could find a way forward, a way to heal, to grow, to become the people they were meant to be. Because change, real change, started with each of them, and it started now.